Lou, go ahead. It's all yours.
Okay. As an introduction, we will see a Hornby train coming down the main line, hopefully. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. I think I have to give it a little push. This is one of two rooms of my collection. This is the operating room. Can you all see, I hope?
Yes.
Yeah, we can see it, Lou. Go ahead.
Beautiful. Okay, well, we've passed the first test. What we see here is a Hornby Express pulled by a 440 Yorkshire. It's actually a relatively rare locomotive in the Hornby world. You can see some of the big stations I'm going to be talking about later. This one is a beautiful Keebree station from the early 1930s. Another Keebree from 1935. A Dahl windmill with the miller and the donkey. A big Cabo station, CABO for Carl Bachman. We'll talk about that later. Some more Keebree from the mid-1930s. And we'll let the train take a rest now, and we'll move into the next room. Okay, we're in my office museum now. You can see that I've used up every inch of space I can find. Roland DiGilio and I have a contest going to see who can get the most stuff into the available space. And it's a very difficult challenge. What I'd like to do is start off by working through some of the trains, locomotives, and rolling stock on what I call my wall of trains. As was mentioned in the introduction, I started out as a Lionel guy, but somewhere along the way, around the early 1990s, I became intrigued by British Hornby. Now, for those of you that don't know Hornby, Hornby is to England and the colonies what Lionel was to the United States. They produced a broad line of trains from some cheap stuff up to very expensive. They had beautiful catalogs, and they had a very intensive distribution system. But interestingly enough, in comparison with Lionel, one thing that they did not really do was utilize the power of operating accessories. Apparently, they felt that there wasn't enough, perhaps, housing with the appropriate electricity. A lot of their trains were still clockwork. So whereas Lionel was pumping out all kinds of interesting operating accessories in the 1920s and 30s, Hornby did nothing. It's almost as if they didn't even know what a solenoid was. But what they did produce was some fascinating both lithographed as well as painted tin plate. And I'd like to show you in the first part of my presentation some of the Hornby items that I have, and then we could move toward other producers of toy trains. And let's start with the most rare. Can everybody see this locomotive number 2800? Say yes.
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 And you'll see the two passenger cars that say Canadian Pacific. Yes? Yep.
Yes.
Now, note that those passenger cars are very similar to these passenger cars, and in turn, these passenger cars. And what Hornby did was take its number 2 special passenger car, of which this is the more common example, and they produced it for the French market, and they produced it for the North American Canadian Pacific market. And it was a disaster. The Canadian market for the O gauge just didn't materialize. The train was produced only in 1931-32. I actually have a catalog for it, as well as the set box. And I'm not sure anybody else in the world has the set box. But in any event, that then turned out to be one of the rarest, if not rarest, Hornby items produced. Another category that is relatively rare in Hornby world are its international locomotives. Here we see a locomotive labeled FCO, the Ferrocarril Centro Oriente, one of the Argentine major railroad lines. They also produced one labeled FCS for the Southern Argentine line, and they produced a couple of others, one of which is extraordinarily rare, and I don't even own it. In addition to the Argentine and the Canadian Pacific, another rarity on the wall of trains is this Caledonian early Hornby, probably what, 1922, 23. And it comes complete with 2 passenger cars, one of which has the Caledonian Railroad crest on it. Very, very rare. But it's a very interesting question as to how many people are really interested in it now. A whole generation of Hornby collectors has come and gone, and who knows what the future holds in terms of the value of these rare items. Another Hornby piece that I want to focus on is the famous Princess Elizabeth. Can everybody see it? Yes?
Right, we have
Yes.
your thumb in the way right now.
What?
Your thumb's covering up part of the picture. There you go.
My thumb is covered it up. Whoops. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes, you can see it. The number 6201 Princess Elizabeth. Everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Good.
Stunning.
Now, you are looking at Hornby's only 6-coupled locomotive. While Lionel was pumping out the 224, the 225, the 226, and ultimately the big Hudson, Hornby only made one 6-coupled locomotive, and it still commands a pretty good price on the market, although not as much as it did a few years ago. Most of us think that the front of the locomotive has some beautiful design characteristics, but the rear, and particularly the pony truck, leaves much to be desired. Well, who stepped forward to, shall we say, improve the situation? none other than Bassett-Loke. And here we have Bassett-Loke Corgi's representation of the same locomotive, the 6201 Princess Elizabeth. And you can see that the proportions are much better. And the Bassett-Loke is built to scale. So let's continue on in the Hornby world. In the late 1920s, Hornby began producing what they called true to type locomotives, whereas the early 20s had these interesting toy locomotives. The late 20s introduced a series of true to type locomotives for each of the major British railroads, the Southern, the LMS, the London Northeastern, and the Great Western. And I have examples of each. Here is the Southern. Here is the LMS, the London, Midland, and Scottish. Here's the early version of the London, Midland, and Scottish without lining on the tender, but and with the red driving wheels. The Great Western and the London Northeastern we'll have to see in the other room. Actually, we saw the London Northeastern running, pulling those two coaches. So maybe I could just stop briefly now. Any questions about Hornby?
Stunning displays. Did you know Bob Marshall? from down
Sure,
in Maryland? Okay.
sure. And that
You-
Yorkshire that was pulling those two coaches is from Bob Marshall's collection.
Yeah, we miss him
Oh,
badly.
we miss him terribly.
And Chip
I
is
have a
out.
lot of photos that I took of Bob Marshall's collection at his house. And he was wonderful. We had some very interesting collectors of Hornby who are no longer with us. And it's very sad indeed. And Bob Marshall is certainly one of them. Okay, if there are no questions about Hornby, let's go on to the next major manufacturer represented on the wall of trains. And that is Bing, Gebrüder Bing Nuremberg. Bing was, where's my notes? I had my notes. My notes have just disappeared. That's nice. Shows what happens when you try to plan. Well, Bing dates back to about 1892. You can correct me, Roland, if I'm wrong. And it was located in Nuremberg. And it was the largest toy company in the world. And it produced all kinds of items and was a major producer of toy trains. Its big competitor in Germany was Marklin. And Marklin was more upscale, but Bing had, in addition to its very low-priced, cheap line, it had some upscale items of its own. Now, as we look at Bing, here, for example, at the top is a one of the more common, larger O-gauge Bing locomotives, the George V, and it came in different colors, came painted for the London Northwestern. This one is the London, Midland, and Scottish version. And a second Bing locomotive of interest is the big Pacific here. That came over the years in live steam, electric, and in this case, clockwork. This particular locomotive dates to the late 1920s. Bing also made an Atlantic version of the so-called wind cutters. This is one of their 18-volt motors. And again, from basically the 1920s, although some of these date back earlier, you can find gauge 1 examples of this big Pacific much earlier in the catalogs going back to 1910, 1915, thereabouts. Another category of great interest to me in the Bing world are their super clockwork locomotives. I think, Roland, we agree that this clockwork locomotive by Bing, 6-coupled, made in the late 1920s, had the most powerful clockwork mechanism of any O-gauge toy locomotive. My good friend Dirk Hurdle and I have done tests with these locomotives, and it's astonishing how far they can go on one wind. They came also in the different liveries of the major railroads at the time, the big 4. You had the London, Midland, and Scottish, the Great Western, the London Northeastern, and the Southern. They're not terribly expensive, but they're a lot of fun if you like to run clockwork. And I think that I have one more, where to go? They also made continental versions of that locomotive. Here it is. The 3700, which has the exact same outline, was actually produced not with the Southern tender, but with a continental tender for the German railways. And I've yet to find that tender. Another category that's important for Bing are their passenger cars. And some of the most interesting ones are the early ones, but I don't collect the really early ones. There are several within the TCA who do. And but I tend to focus on the cars from the early to late 1920s. And here we have an example of the 1921 Bing for Bassett-Lowke series. You'll see this one says LMS. And then I can show you, if I can find it, the exact same car, but it says Midland instead of LMS. Did everybody see that? Yes?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Okay. The easiest ones to find in the 1921 series are the London and Northwestern. You see them on the internet all the time, but it's not easy to find them in really good condition, unfortunately. A lot of times they have problems. This dining car here is fascinating because originally it was made by another continental manufacturer called Corette. Corette went out of business in 1915, and Bassett-Lowke ended up with it, with the dies, and they produced the LMS in the early 1920s, whereas the original dining car produced by Corette was for the London and Northwestern. The cars that I really like made by Bing are later. They're the so-called Metropa cars, And you can see here the Schlafwagen, the sleeping car, complete with bed covering, mattresses, pillows. The Speisewagen, the dining car with tables and chairs. And they came in both the late 1920s version with the clerestory roofs and the late 20s, early 30s arch roof version. This car here, though, is very unusual. It's unusual because it looks just like the others. And indeed, it was made from the same dies. But in fact, it was made by Kraus. Kraus took over some of the Bing dyes and materials when Bing went out of business in 1932-33. Its production ended up in the hands of such people as Kraus, Karl Bubb of Nuremberg, and various others. So this Schlafwagen here has the Kraus decals on it, but as I said, looks very much like the Bing and is somewhat harder to find, not surprisingly. The third company in England that competed with, not the third, I should say, the second company in England that competed with Hornby was Bassett Loke. Bassett Loke tended to focus on, quote, young engineers in training. They were more upscale. They produced all kinds of locomotives in six-coupled design, and but they cost a lot more than Hornby did. Here is the famous Bassett Loke Flying Scotsman. It used to be Jim Store's locomotive. Some of you, I'm sure, knew Jim Store, wonderful collector from the Boston area. And some have said that this is one of the most handsome lithographed locomotives ever produced. And together, Bassett Loke produced a range of coaches that were longer than the Bing for Bassett Loke and longer than the Hornby cars. And I only have examples of the London Northeastern Teak, but I'm always keeping my eyes open to see if I can get a Great Western. Maybe I'd like to be able to get one of those. We'll see whether or not I succeed. Finally, on the wall of trains, we'll take a look at three more items. The first is very modern. This is Ace trains, Alan Levy's operation, and there are others in the UK who compete with them, like Darstead. These were produced, quote, in the Hornby style. Hornby, of course, never made an O-gauge version of the Mallard, but Ace did. And this has become quite collectible, interestingly enough. It operates on 18 volts, and it's pretty much of a monster. It has no sound worth the name. It has no whistle. It does have smoke, but it is beautiful, and the finish of the enamel is very, very nice. A second item I'd like to talk about briefly is this strange little beast, a tank locomotive produced by Walkers and Holtzapfel. It's called a controlled clockwork tank locomotive. You put the key in the hole and you turn it, and you can control the speed of the locomotive by the lever coming out of the top of the cab so that this thing can creep, absolutely creep along the track. Very, very fascinating. Amazing to watch work. Not easy to find out there in the real world. Was very expensive when it hit the original retail stores. Indeed, it cost as much to buy this tank locomotive as it did to buy the Hornby Princess Elizabeth, both about 5 pounds back in 1940. Hard to believe. Hard to believe. These two tank locomotives up here are both big super clockwork. And finally, we complete our tour of the wall of trains with a big electric, again, clockwork. Most of the owners of toy trains in the 1920s and early 30s owned clockwork trains because the electrical system in Europe, Britain especially, was just not as well developed as it was in the United States. That's why a rough estimate, if you go looking for Hornby or something like that in England, you'll get about anywhere from 60 to 75% will be clockwork and the rest electric. Okay, I'll stop for a minute or two. That's the end of our tour of the first case. And any other questions before we move ahead?
What are the cars at the top of the wall there? Up by
I'm
the
sorry?
ceiling?
What?
What are the cars that you're showing now that at the top of the
Up in the case.
trains? At the
Oh,
top?
you mean the tin stuff?
Yes.
Yeah,
Oh, well, those are very cute. You know, those are those, what do they call them? Not magic. There's a word for it. They have a little wheel on the bottom that turns. So you wind it up and it goes along and it hits the wall and turns and goes another
Oh.
direction. There
Okay.
used to be a big supply of those things back in the 1970s. Japanese, Indian,
Yeah.
made in India, a lot of them made in India. Yeah, they're very colorful, lithograph,
Yeah.
of course. But since you're asking about the very top, how many of you have ever seen this?
Whew.
And I
Wow.
found that at York of all places. That is a
Wow.
trolley bus. And it is decorated from Mexico City.
wow.
Ah,
So it carries the sign Zocalo on its front, and it actually has the correct logo for the Department of Street Railways of Mexico City.
okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
Lou, I have a question.
yes.
Throughout your presentation, you keep talking about what you're calling a six couple or a six coupler locomotive. Can you
Oh,
explain that?
I'd be happy to, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
When you look at the locomotive driving wheels of a steam locomotive, 1, 2, 3, and then there's 3 on the other side. So that means it's 6 coupled is the terminology they use.
I see.
Whereas here you'd have 4 coupled. And in the US tradition, we'd say it's a 4-4-0, 2 on one side,
Right.
2 on the other, 2 on one side, 2 on the other, a 4-4-0. This would be a 4-6-2. The British and the Continental guys, by contrast, they don't like that approach. They count axles. And
Okay.
we'll leave that for the graduate course.
Hello,
Yeah, sure.
what curve radii did Hornby offer? I noticed that your Princess Elizabeth has flanges on all the drivers. So what track?
Well, that's a really great question. Here is where Hornby emulated Lionel to a degree. Hornby came out when they brought out this locomotive in 1937, 38. They actually brought out the track over which it could run. And it was broad gauge, wide radius track. I think it's 072. Roland, is it 072?
Yeah, that's correct. It is basically an 072 radius.
Right.
Bassett Logue brought out 072 clockwork track in the late 20s, I think it was, or maybe
Late
the early
20s.
30s.
Yeah, so Hornby had actually 3 types of track. It had some really tight curved stuff for the cheapo clockwork, and then it had somewhat broader set of curves, and then it had the 072.
Most of their curves were 2-foot radius, for
Right.
most of the regular stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, if you ever want to really know the answer to every question you ask Roland, not me. He is a walking encyclopedia. Now, having asked that question, though, I would note that this Bassett Logue version, for reasons best known to the way they designed the pony truck, will not operate on my 054 curves. Whereas, I mean, I would have thought it would have without any problem. The right-of-ways, all big right-of-way locomotives operate over 054 with no trouble whatsoever. So as a result, this locomotive is never run on my railroad. Very sad. I acquired it so I could compare it with the Hornby version, and I thought I would have a lot of fun running it, but that was not to be. Okay, any other questions about the wall of trains?
Hey
All
Lou,
right.
were any of these trains made after World War II? This type of train?
Oh, yeah, sure. Very good question. I'm glad you asked. Now, Hornby in 1939, 38, 39, brought out what they called 00. And that was scale, 00 gauge, not Lionel 00 gauge, but it ran on, well, it was 4 millimeters to the foot, right, Roland? And Lionel was 3.5 millimeters to the foot, something
I
like
believe that's correct. I'm not sure.
something like that. But you see them all the time. It shows 00, Hornby 00. And it's basically the same width. The track is the same width as HO. But the scale of 00 is 1 in 76 versus HO's 1 in 87. So when Hornby brought that out in 1938-39, from a strategic point of view, they said, that's the future of toy trains. And after the war, they basically, for all intents and purposes, eliminated most of their O gauge offerings. They still kept some O gauge out there, but it was the cheaper stuff. They never produced the Prince Elizabeth after the war. There's some question as to whether they produced any of the true to scale stuff after the war. They might have done some, but not much. And although they did produce, well, we really haven't talked about these 2 cars here, and I ought to talk about it. Those are both Hornby. They also are labeled Metropa, and Metropa was the German equivalent of Wagenlichts or the sleeping car company. Hornby started with a blue version of this for the French Hornby, and then they produced some very hard to find reddish orange versions of Metropa. After the war, Hornby produced some passenger rolling stock, but it was not the painted stuff. It was the lithographed tin plate. And I'll show you an example right up here of a Hornby lithographed tin plate. That was produced before the war and after the war. But by 1964, Hornby had stopped supplying any O gauge and focused on 00 until it got sold and acquired in a whole series of transactions that are much too complicated to discuss tonight.
Getting back to the 00HO scale and gauge. British 00 was scaled to 4 millimeters to the foot, but ran on HO track, 16.5 millimeters across the track. American 00 was truer to scale, the same 4 millimeters to the foot, but operated on 3/4 inch gauge, about 19 millimeters. And,
Right.
And there was more than a few companies that made 00 in the States, mostly for kit builders.
Right, but Lionel managed to come into the middle of that mess and came up with their own version, the famous Lionel OOs.
The
And
Lionel
Lionel-
00, yeah, getting back, the Lionel 00 was a 19 millimeter gauge or 3/4 of an inch, which was American 00. Unfortunately, the majority of the manufacturers post-war went to HO.
That's correct. That's
Even
correct.
Atlas made 00 flex track at one point. Over.
Okay, well, that's very helpful, and that's a whole session of its own, and I'm certainly not qualified to lead it.
Lou, this is Clem. Can I show you something?
Sure.
You got that Overland Express sitting up there that Katie was talking about?
Yeah.
Can you see this one?
Wait a minute, what am I looking at? No, I'm looking at myself.
Yeah, Lou's locked in.
I don't think I could see anything from you guys unless, Chris-
You have the spotlight on you, Lou.
yeah, I don't, wait,
Lou, it's red and gray. It's
There
big
it
time
is.
beat up. It's big time ugly. However, the full thing weighs about 20 pounds.
Try it again, Clem. We can see you now.
We can see you now, yeah.
I could see you now. Well, I just lost you, Clem, you're not on now.
You got to talk, Clem.
Speak up, Clem.
There-
He's probably going to
The
get
thing
it.
weighs 20 pounds. I can't pick it up and talk at the same time, which makes Chris very happy. Let me try again. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Look at this mess on the underneath. Steel wheels, cast steel, lathe turned steel wheels,
A little higher.
aluminum siding on the thing, awful looking thing, but it runs on O gauge.
Do
So
you
when
think somebody, Clem, do you think somebody took that guy up there and converted it?
oh yeah, it's back room. The screws are cross points, so they're post 33. Sheet metal, sheet aluminum, sheet everywhere. The roller is post-war, pre-war flyer. There's lead weights in the damn thing. Oh man, what's fun for me is I took it to the National Capital Trackers layout one time, and me and Tom McKinney were over one side on a smaller later, and I ran this thing, and of course all the citizens were knocked over. The accessories were knocked over because it's wide and ugly and just good thing. Another item, thank you for mentioning the late Dr. Jim Storer. I absolutely thought the world of that man. Did a great deal of stuff to help me in going on. And
Well, Storer was a good friend of mine, and we might as well mention his buddy in the same breath. This was Michael Cans.
Michael Can, it's incredible. I've been to both of their houses.
Oh, sure. I was at their houses all the time. And
Oh,
Storer
my.
and I would have Chinese lunches every month or so up in Lexington. But
Yeah.
this is in Michael's Stick Cans collection. And as I said, the Flying Scotsman is from Storers along with the two coaches here. And we're gonna move, if you're willing to let me do so. I want to move to the next cabinet because it has an awful lot of interesting history. And I think you will enjoy it. This cabinet here has, starting from the top, some Hornby that we'll talk about, Danish Whitrock, Hornby for the French market, both original and Hachette, some more Danish Whitrock. This is all O gauge now. Everything on this display is O gauge. Then we have French Hornby pulling some Metropa cars. We have the famous USA produced in the United States freight set that I will talk about at some length. We then have a very rare piece, Hornby for the Danish market, which took the USA cars and repainted them for the Danish market, the DSB. We see a JEP locomotive there, SNCF, from a famous collector whose name I just blanked out, but I'll get it back in a minute. And then we have the USA Hornby set with the green pasture cars and the red locomotive. We have the second Hornby Pullman pasture car set with the green locomotive and the yellow cars. And then we have the extraordinarily rare Hornby CPR set post-war for the Canadian market. Behind it, we have this Swedish Hornby set, the SJ, again, with USA type cars that have been painted for Sweden. And then we have two Hornby freight cars, one for the Hornby Railway Company and one for Meccano, each hauling coal. And finally, we have the Hornby Silver Link from 1938-39. We have the red version of the Hornby cheap streamliner from that same period. I've been looking for the green version for that monkey for over 20 years with no luck. And finally, we have two examples of Hornby's Bugatti rail cars. Hornby made a whole series of those, French Hornby, some 3 cars and some 2 cars. So there's a lot of interesting stuff on this display. And I'd like to walk you through some of it if we have time. Why don't we start with Hornby USA? I don't know. Do any of you remember the articles that were published in the TCA magazine on the subject by myself? Probably not. It's been a while. Classic Toy Trains also had an article on them. Back in 1927, Hornby had the idea of coming it gotten into the United States through its Meccano sets, and it was going to produce them in the United States, and it had the idea that they would produce their own clockwork trains to compete with Ives, to compete with Hofner, to compete with well, not with Lionel Electric, but Lionel, well, not the Lionel Clockwork. There wasn't much to compete with there. But they thought that there would be plenty of opportunity to compete for the US market. So they put together a plant in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And their first offering was a catalog that I have an original for. And it had 2 passenger trains and a freight train. Here was the freight train, and here were the 2 passenger trains. And in the hyperbole of the time, they claimed that the motors were second to none and that everybody should buy British Hornby. Well, it turned out to be a disaster, and the factory closed around 1929. So they had all of these lithographed cars and sheets of lithographed material sitting there, and they didn't know what to do. So they took it back to England, and they did all sorts of things. The one thing they did was they took some of the cars that were already produced and had the what I call American Flyer type T couplers on them. They simply replaced the couplers on those with the, I don't know if you can see it, the link couplers that Hornby was using at the time. But there weren't many of those that actually came from United States inventory and were, the couplers were changed. What they did do was repaint these cars. They painted a series of Metropa cars. They painted the Danish. They painted the Swedish, and they also painted some for the Swiss market. Extraordinarily hard to find. I've never owned any of the Swiss Hornby. Jim Storer did. He owned a Swiss tender, and he sold that many, many years ago at a very high price, as it turned out. So in any event, there was Hornby trying to compete, and it just failed. Now, a lot of people see Hornby on the market, and they say, looking like this, says US outline and stuff like that. And they say, oh boy, that must have been the stuff that was made in the United States. But almost all the time, it wasn't. The only stuff that was actually made in the United States has the T couplers as well as the printing stated Made in USA on them. But even sometimes the Made in USA can be deceptive because those were original cars taken back and had their couplers changed in England. So that's the story of USA Hornby. Any questions on that? Notice how they worked very hard when they did their lithography on the freight train. That Pennsylvania boxcar has beautiful lithography on it. But that's the story. Now, a couple other things while we're on this display. How many of you have ever heard of Whitrock? Would all say, shout at the same time. Well, Whitrock was made in Denmark and may have been made in Norway, possibly. It's post-war, and it has a lot of Germanic influence from producers like Distler, HWN, stuff like that. But it's very nice lithography. A lot of hard work went into this O-gauge lithography. But at the same time, they also had painted passenger cars as well as lithographed. And the locomotives were pretty straightforward 040 clockwork. And they too came in somewhat different designs. Still working our way through this cabinet. We have an original Hornby PLM streamliner from 1938-39. And I have the box to that somewhere. But then we have the Hachette replica version that was produced in the 1980s and 90s. And they did a beautiful job of reproducing the 1939 set. The coaches are virtually indistinguishable, but the locomotives are somewhat different. You can see the striping on the original is not quite the same as on the replica. Okay, that takes care of that cabinet. Questions?
Lou, we're going to need to give you the 5-minute warning here.
Okay, 5-minute warning and we're going to be done for the day, right?
But I'd like to take some closing comments, and then I'd like to invite you back because just as I told everybody, we barely scratched the surface.
Well, that's certainly true, and I'd love to come back. So
One quick question.
What?
One more quick question, if I may.
Sure.
Did you say that they made wind-up reproductions post-war?
This
Clockwork?
Hachette. Yeah, Hachette is
Wow.
clockwork. The
Wow.
Hachette.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's very poor windup, by the way. If you ever buy one of those, be careful. They just fall apart. They've nice
Lou, can-
photography, but not.
Lou, can you talk about the O gauge trains in the shelf to the left of that shelf right there? Talk about the
O
O gauge.
gauge? Well,
O-gauge
I've only
trains
got a
that-
couple of minutes, so this is the only one I want to talk about. This is Hungarian mint from 1950 to 1955. It's a beautiful locomotive, runs on 18-volt DC, and it's just magnificent. It's very similar, though, in some respects to O-gauge locomotives produced by Fleischmann, and there it is. This guy here is Japanese, KTM. Somebody worked very hard converting it to a SEPTA commuter car. And it's a beautiful, beautiful piece of work. The other two are straightforward. Those are just K-line, quote, EP5s. Well, the New Haven is the EP5, but the Great Northern is certainly not an EP5. But of course, there was a streamlined Great Northern Electric after the war, but it was much bigger. In my last couple of minutes, I just want to focus on the stations here, because the next time I come before you, I hope to spend a lot of time on stations. This guy here is the Bing Sandstone Station, the 10-236, and it was in the catalog a long time. First came into the catalog, I don't know, somewhere around 1910, certainly by 1912, 1915. And it stayed in the catalog all the way to the end of the 1920s. It's a beautiful piece, and it can be found out there. It's a little pricey, but it can be found. Unfortunately, it's often found in not the best condition, but this one happens to be in good condition. This is a very common Bing station. It goes back actually earlier. The earliest versions of this station date back to 1905, 1910. As does this station here, Bing, 1905, 1910, roughly. And I will finish up my last minute or two by introducing a manufacturer you've never heard of, Carl Bachmann. Cabo, C-A-B-O. There's another Cabo big station on the layout. You may have seen it at the beginning. We'll look at it next time. But these are, most people never heard of them. And yet I think they are really a lot of fun. This painted tin plate, no lithography here, painted tin plate. Okay, have I used up my time?
Just about.
Just about. Still,
We could be here for another 3 hours if we let you.
well, I'm here.
Wonderful.
I'm here. All right. The last thing I'll show you is my latest acquisition. Anybody hear of the company called Dahl and Company?
Yes.
Well, this is their Stadt Großbahn, the main station that Dahl made that would compete against the likes of Carl Bachmann, Keebury in the other room, and Bing. I think it's a delightful piece myself. I just got it, and I think it fits right into this very nice display here. This is a station made by Heinrich Wimmer, HWN. It's post-war German lithograph around 1950. And you say to yourself, wow, what an interesting station. But look at the ads. They're all United States ads. So either Wimmer was about to make an assault on the United States market, or maybe they were making them for the troops that were stationed in Germany. I don't know. Who knows? But it's an interesting piece.
Ooh, a lot of this, Markland was done for the Marshall Plan, as you know.
Right.
Markland was the only company that was allowed to continue to produce trains during the war due to Hermann Göring collecting Markland. And
Well, you know, that's interesting. Did Fleischmann produce during the war?
supposedly no, but I wouldn't swear to it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It was a very strange situation because Fleischmann had Jewish heritage, and yet it escaped the
It-
being taken over, as
Well,
did Paul and as did
yeah, when der Grosser General is collects trains, it tends to save a few things.
oh yeah, and
I've had a-
again, the boys that had that Borsig, they all seem to have his Borsig, right?
Oh yeah, but I have the pleasure of living in Germany for 3 years, and so I know Dieter Haas and Charles Becker. You have Becker's books, right?
Oh sure. Well, not
14.
all of them, but I have one.
Yeah, I have them.
Yeah.
We sold them in America, and Dieter
Well,
Haas.
Wagner just died, didn't he?
Who?
Wagner. WAGNER, the guy that co-authored the book on Eisenbahn.
Oh, I do not know, sir.
I think he did. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
In any event, you can see that the next time we meet, there's still more stuff to show you in this room. And I look forward to doing it. And then we'll have some time to run these trains.
Wonderful.
That
Lou, where
sounds
do you
great.
live?
Wonderful, Lou.
Thank you.
Today you can talk to me about bulldog trains in Japan.
I know nothing about bulldog trains in Japan, unfortunately.
Weiß nicht either.
Yeah.
Spur 1 with fiber wheels. Grosser ugly.
All right, guys, we're gonna try to wrap this up here. Lou, I want to thank you on behalf of everybody this evening. I think we all had a wonderful time. And we'll have to figure out when we can bring you back and do this some more and add to the collection, or add to our knowledge base on everything. I don't know if everyone realizes that Lou was doing this tonight using his cell phone as the camera. If you heard at the beginning, he was trying to get logged in on his cell phone. And everything he did tonight was walking around and talking while he was holding the cell phone to share the collection. So that in itself is a major accomplishment, just to get that all done. And we really deeply appreciate it, Lou. It's been a wonderful evening for everybody, and looking forward to the next time you get to share with us.
Where does Lou reside?
I'm sorry?
Where does Lou reside? Where do you live?
Suburb of Boston.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, that's one of the treats of going to conventions. Some of us were fortunate enough to see the collection when we were at the New England convention a couple years ago. And that's one of the wonderful benefits of traveling around the country and going to the different locations with the TCA convention. You truly get to see some of the local sites that we just don't see.
Well,
I agree with your assessment, because I think one of the nicest things of the TCA convention is visiting the various layout tours of each of the conventions, and that's always a highlight. So you're spot on.
Well, I've been a member of the TCA since 1971, and I remember putting a V next to my name or something like that, saying that I'd like to have visitors. And it was amazing how few took advantage of that over the years. And I think that this Zoom thing is a way of maybe, ratcheting up the fellowship within the TCA, because we can not only talk to our friends, but we can see their collections. So
I agree.
I think that any of you guys that know how to do Zoom, we don't have to have, wait till Chris and Mike beat their brains out to do it. You can have one-on-ones. You can use Zoom all the time. And I think we're at a beginning of a new era.
Yep.
Lou,
All
did you
right,
know?
everybody, I'm going to kill the recording unless there's any more questions for Lou. I'll leave the Zoom up, but I do want to kill the recording unless there's any more questions for Lou.
Lou, did you ever get to Jean Santi Calusi's collection?
Yes,
Oh, stunning.
I got, not only did I get there, but I have 2 pictures to prove it of me standing next to the Good Count in Lausanne at 33 Avenue du Remain.
In his castle. You've been to the 2nd floor? Is it the 3rd floor or something where they?
I know, I was so, but the problem, Clem, at that time, I barely knew what Hornby was. And so
Full
I was-
Dorks forever.
I was just kind of looking and looking. I didn't have any of the zillions of books that I now have. This was back in the mid 1980s that I was there.
I was there in 74, 75
Yeah,
for the
yeah.
train
Oh,
congress.
what a collection. I mean,
What a
just
collection. You know what his
unbelievable.
father said about the trains?
I don't know. I think he put it in the introduction to the book, but I forgot.
The Count, of course, is a count, and the father said, "What are you doing for life?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to play trains." And the father said, "No, what are you going to do for life?" And he said, "Well, next time you're around, dear father, have a look in the vault." So father came out of the vault and checked up the finances, and it was a whole lot more money than he had inherited. So the count said, the father said, "I know what you're doing, but keep it up, son." He and his lady and the Mercedes and the Rolls Royce, that he had his engineer empty the car when he came back from any auction. And when you dealt with the count in an auction, if he sat up front, and if he held his little card up, it never came down. So do whatever the hell you want, because he's going to own it.
Right, absolutely. And there's a guy named Huskins in England that was doing the same thing with Hornby, a banker. And he was driving prices up like you wouldn't believe. This was during the late 1990s and into the 2000s. But I'm showing you this JEP again because since we're remembering famous collectors, this is the only piece I have from Al Markham. You remember Al?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know, sorry.
No, oh my God. Al's collection up in Toronto was unbelievable. And I mean, unbelievable.
That was started by his father, wasn't it?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. It was truly unbelievable. Well, Roland's has got some fabulous stuff. Maybe you'll take a Zoom session, Roland.
Possible. We might.
Yeah.
We can do that. I'll have to see if it'll work with my tablet. I'm on the computer right now, so it's kind of hard to pick that up and move it around.
Yeah, it is. But now that you can see that you can do it with an iPhone, you don't even need the stupid computer. It's
I
unbelievable.
don't have an iPhone.
Oh, you don't have an
No,
iPhone? Oh, well.
The tablet will work.
Yeah, it should. I got to check it out. It's relatively recent.
Right.
I
Oh,
haven't
then,
really used it much
Can you
yet.
see my face, Lou?
yeah, then it should definitely work. But in any event, like I say, I'm more than happy to chat. I'll chat all night tonight, but coming to the end, have you cut off the recording?
I haven't yet, but I'm about ready to.
All right, so we'll cut off the recording with the famous panorama. Panorama.
You're not going to do the famous Uncle Don sign off?
No. But thanks a lot. How many?